Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 2. Today, we are going to discuss adaptations to cardiovascular training. Let's look at this slide, and I want you to look at all the athletes here. We have Lisa Bentley, Clara Hughes, we have professional cyclists, Alberto Contador, professional marathon runners, tennis players. And the question is, what do these athletes have in common? And the answer really is they all have a solid cardiovascular conditioning base. They have to perform for many hours, multiple sessions per day, many hours per week, high volume, high intensity training. Many of them can sustain a very high intensity for a long period of time, from 800 meters to an Ironman. They have high maximum steady state, or a high, what I consider a pain threshold that they can sustain. Let's look at tennis. Tennis may not be considered a classic cardiovascular sport. However, the matches can be up to 2 to 3 hours. Many of these athletes on the slide are operating at their genetic ceiling, so their greatest potential. There's only marginal gains, small changes of 1 to 2% that can take place for them. So today what we're going to discuss is the physiology that underpins their performance. How are these extreme athletes so good? What are the physiological adaptations that underpin their performance? And really, endurance or cardiovascular training kind of has a bad rap. And this is because people associate long and slow to cardiovascular training, and this is not the case. Conditioning is considered anything greater than 2 minutes that has a high aerobic component. So cardiovascular fitness is the basis to build all other components of fitness from. Now let's move away from an elite athlete and talk about the general population. So why is having a good cardiovascular fitness level important? Well, first of all, it is the basis of health, that there's a strong correlation between good cardiovascular fitness, or your VO2 max, and the risk of all-cause morbidity, metabolic syndrome, obesity, insulin resistance. So it's the basis of health. Number 2, it improves tasks of everyday life. You have more energy. Things are done easier because you're more efficient at delivering oxygen. You perceive things to be less hard than they are. That there's physiological adaptations, but also the psychological adaptations and how you perceive your effort. And then lastly, a cardiovascular fitness level is important for recovery. So if you're more fit, you have less stress on the body. Between shifts, between sessions, between sets, between reps, between work shifts, the body recovers faster from tournaments, from multi-day sessions, and from tasks of everyday life. Now let's discuss our overview for this week's lecture. First off, we're going to talk about the general adaptation syndrome. This might be a refresher from previous courses. Then we're going to define endurance training. Thirdly, we're going to talk about the limiting factors to endurance performance. Then we're moving into the physiological adaptations to cardiovascular training. And lastly, the impact on performance. So how the physiological adaptations translate into improvements in everyday performance as well as athlete performance. All right, let's get started. So, first off, you probably already know this, but exercise imposes a massive stress to the body. It perturbs homeostasis like nothing else. We have been designed and created to adapt to stress, which is amazing. Because if we didn't, we would be dead at the onset of life when we had to take our first breath. We wouldn't have been able to adapt to being able to breathe outside the womb. So there is something called the SAID principle, and this means specific adaptations to imposed demands. And you may have heard this before, the SAID principle, specific adaptations to imposed demands. Your body responds to the stress placed on it. So if you want to be fast, you have to train to be fast. You have to run fast. You can't run slow and expect your body to be fast. In the same way, if you want to have good endurance, you have to train for endurance. You can't do speed work and assume that the adaptations for speed will carry over to create better endurance. So this is really important. The stress dictates the adaptation. The stress you impose on your body will dictate how your body responds and adapts. This slide showcases something called GAS, or General Adaptation Syndrome. And this was a Russian and German physiologists created this model to explain the short-term effects of exposure to stress. So as you can see, there's 4 phases. The first phase is really the initial, the onset of a stressor. So in this specific example, it was related to the immune system. So you're exposed to an allergen. It could be ragweed in August. It could be something that imposes a stress to your immune system, a virus, for example. So phase 1 is the immune system's adaptive response to stress over time. This is your normal level of resistance. Then we have the onset, or the stressor onset. So we're exposed to the stressor, and then that leads to number B, which is the second phase, which is the compensation phase. Then we see a slight adaptation to C, and then we see phase 3, which is the resistance phase. If we do not develop resistance, or the stressor is greater than our ability to adapt, we lead to something called the decompensation phase. And this can be very toxic, and it can lead to disease, essentially, that your body's in such a state of stress for an extended period of time, chronic stress to the system, chronic stress to the immune system. And what happens? Well, you decrease below your normal level of resistance, and that can lead to disease. So there are 3 main pieces that I want you to understand from this. The first is that we do have a cellular army. These little machines that try to reestablish homeostasis when there's some sort of stressor or perturbation to homeostasis. That there's this initial explosion, but there's repair and growth to be stronger. So then when you're exposed to that stressor again, the response and the stress isn't like that. The second comment I want to make is that the body does adapt when exposed to a stressor, that we are survival driven, that we want to survive. And so what happens is with repeated exposure to the same stressor, for example, exercise, you're repeatedly exposed to that stressor, your body will adapt and get stronger because you don't want to be in a state of stress for too long. And thirdly, too much stress is bad, as we can see in phase 4, the decompensation phase. Too much stress is bad, that there's an optimal amount of stress, and finding that balance is really important. So let's look at some examples of this model. One would be DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, to the first exposure to running or lifting weights after you haven't done it for a while. That first time you go in the gym and you do hamstring, whatever, deadlifts, and you're doing eccentric loading of your hamstrings, or you're going for a run and you're running a lot downhill, the next day, and then 48 hours after, you can hardly walk. Well, this is an example of that initial insult, that stressor onset where we see muscular damage, and what has to happen? Well, an adaptation has to happen. So then when you run that same route a week later, or even 5 days later, the response will not be the same. You will not have the DOMS like you did for that initial run. There's other examples as well. Your exposure to heat, how you can adapt and acclimate to heat. Exposure to altitude. At first, it's really, really a stressor to the system, but over 2 to 3 weeks, you adapt, and so you don't breathe as heavily. It's not as much of a stress to the system. So I want you to think about some examples of this general adaptation syndrome and how your body adapts to chronic stress over time. This figure is a more modern figure of Sill's model of adaptation. and it's more applicable to not the immune system, but to exercise stress. So on the y-axis we have performance. On the x-axis we have the different stages. So we have our overload, then we have our alarm reaction, how the body responds to stress. There's an onset of the stressor. The next stage is the stage of resistance, where we see recovery and muscle growth with an increase in performance. And then we see a plateau, where we're really ready for the new onset of a shock. However, if recovery does not happen, we can see a decrease in performance where we enter into that stage of exhaustion. And this is classic of overreaching syndrome and overtraining syndrome, which can be catastrophic to an athlete and can take 2 months to up to a year, if not beyond, to recover from overtraining. So Sill's model of adaptation shows how the body responds to and overcomes stress. The sweet spot for muscle growth and strength gain hovers between the alarm reaction and resistance. And the stage of resistance. So without diverse training, you may wander into exhaustion. So, you need to find balance here. You need the recovery time to rebuild, that we get overreaching athletes, overtraining athletes, and you get into that stage of exhaustion when the stage of resistance isn't properly adhered to. So you need an onset of the shock to cause a change and increase in performance. You need appropriate recovery time. And really, the specificity dictates the resistance. And this is the SAID principle. Specific adaptations to impose demands. If you want to get fast, you have to train fast. You have to train your body to be fast, not a moderate intensity. You have to work at the polar opposites. You need to work at that very, very high intensity to be really fast. And we'll talk about this more in the coming weeks. This will be our last slide for this mini lecture before we carry on with a subsequent lecture. Here are some considerations for the resistance phase of adaptation. Remember, the stressor can leave your body weak and depleted. More is not always better. Recovery time is pivotal. I remember my first personal training job when I was 17. I thought I would just basically prescribe the same workouts I would do when I was on the national hockey team to an elder or a middle-aged woman. And she almost died. And she was so sore for multiple days afterwards. So that was really, really silly of me to even think that was a possibility. I just assumed everyone was as fit as I was, but that's not the case. So more is not always better. Start slowly and do a progressive overload. So obviously I've learned really well from that first experience. Also, poor nutritional choices can work opposite what you want to accomplish. 80%, even more, 90% of adaptations, weight loss as well as gains in the gym and from cardiovascular training happen from good nutrition, that they go hand in hand, exercise and nutrition. And so they say that you can actually make more gains by choosing a proper diet than exercise alone. As well, internal and external factors can create a greater stress, so be aware. So what are some of those internal and external factors that affect the stress? Well, the environment, pollution, allergies, altitude, heat, humidity, all of those create a greater stress on the system. Sleep, nutrition, disease, sickness, all of these are internal and external factors that can create a greater stress than just exercise alone. So you need to be aware of that in order to prescribe more recovery in certain situations. For example, if someone is training in the heat or at altitude, you wouldn't prescribe the same volume and intensity of training than you would at sea level. You have to wait until they adapt, and then you can progressively increase the volume and intensity. So don't just prescribe. That is only a portion of the work. You need to get feedback from your client. The monitoring part is very important. Listen to your client, get how they're feeling, and be flexible with your plan. All right, that's it for this mini lecture. Another one will be posted subsequent to this. Thanks.